Hey everybody, how you doing? It's your boy, and today I'm going to be discussing two events that happened in the north and the south of England, because it really does speak about the failure that is multiculturalism. Now, what I really need to talk about before I get into the actual examples and why this is an example of its failures, my actual position on multiculturalism. I'm not a big fan, and yes, this is a mixed race guy talking about not being a fan of multiculturalism, but that's because I am in a weird position wherein I've only ever been exposed to one culture growing up. That doesn't mean that I don't learn about other cultures in my own time. It's not like that. I've just been brought up to be British and English. And that's been that way for as long as my family can remember. I used to believe that multiculturalism was a good thing. I thought it was great that we as a country could bring in all these different cultures and different peoples and coexist peacefully. Unfortunately, I fell for the classic leftist conflation. Multiculturalism is not the same as multi-ethnic. You can have people of different ethnicities and they can still share the same culture. In fact, you may have a situation wherein they may be different ethnically and also speak different languages, but because they have one language in common, that helps breed a kind of cultural similarity which allows them to kind of synergize together. We've seen this in antiquity with the Alans and the Vandals. They were a multi-ethnic group. They used to be separate, but then joined together and formed their own kind of mini kingdom. And of course, a more modern example would be the melting pot of the United States. In America especially, you had different types of Europeans coming over from their respective countries to live in the United States. You even had Chinese workers, Japanese people, Koreans. And what we saw, especially in the early 20th century and the 19th century, people buy into the culture. They bought into the American dream, they bought into the ethic of the place. They left their old culture behind for the most part, including old rivalries and old enemies, and lived pretty much side by side other communities, and they all became American very quickly over a span of a couple of decades, if not less. That's multi-ethnic, but it's not necessarily multicultural. These are people coming over to become another culture, to embrace this. But recently, as of the late 20th century, we've had this multicultural thing, but multiculturalism is not the same as multi-ethnic. America of the 1800s to the mid-20th century was multi-ethnic, but it was not multicultural. The one thing that bound all these people together was American culture, not their separate cultures. Multiculturalism is basically, to me, and this is what it really is, the concept of a variety of cultures coming together to live in the same country, but they don't integrate. The migrant cultures that arrive are not expected to adapt to the local culture. They do not integrate. It's kind of expected that they will, but it's almost as if they don't have to. And this, in turn, creates, in my opinion, more segregation and more problems than, say, just being a multi-ethnic country like America is or was. And that is my main problem with multiculturalism. There's no expectation to integrate, and as a result of that, there is no societal cohesion. Things begin to break down because people who come over here, depending on where they come from, will either integrate because maybe they already share some similarities with the host culture, maybe there was a link between empires, or they're just very close by. But with others, they bring their culture with them, they bring customs and the habits that they had in the previous lives, and then just live like that. They close themselves off, and they live as if they had never left their home country. For example, certain Muslim communities do that, certain African communities will not integrate, they will just live in their own little self-imposed ghettos, which is weird because surely you were leaving that country to leave the life you were leaving behind for a better one. And not only that, it just breaks a certain kind of etiquette. I guess there is an unwritten rule that when you are in Rome, you do as the Romans do. But it seems to me that that rule has been left to the wayside for some reason. Mainly because certain leftist groups have decided that that is now racist, and we shouldn't expect migrant cultures to come over here and integrate and to adopt British culture, because how else are we going to integrate all these people? How else are we going to have societal cohesion? That's not to mention the fact that when there's too much immigration like we have now, where it's mass immigration, they begin to compete for jobs, they begin to compete for other things like welfare and health services, which creates a burden on the state, which creates resentment for the native population who feel that they're being cheated out, because there are true stories of people who have been on waiting lists for housing and all sorts, but they're being pushed further and further back because an immigrant family has moved over and they get first priority, despite the fact that some of these families who are on this waiting list who are native, or are like third or second or fourth generation immigrant families themselves who are practically naturalised at this point, they get thrust further and further down because of these new arrivals, which creates resentment. And not only that, these people aren't integrating, therefore they are not really interacting with the local people as much as they should be. Some of these people don't even speak the language of the native land. They just live their entire lives in this little enclave and then die never learning English or French or Spanish or anything like that. That is not something that helps a person integrate and live in a different country. That doesn't help them at all. How are they supposed to function? How are people meant to communicate? Because communication is incredibly important when it comes to interacting and creating a good society. If you can't communicate, that's only going to cause trouble. The special treatment that may be perceived or is happening to these people will only look bad to the people who are native, and they will lash out. And this creates, of course, racial tension or ethnic tension. And it's not helped by the fact that certain left-wing groups, they all know who they are, will, of course, use this tension for their own gains. And that's why I don't like it, because it's not how you run a country. You can't just run a country with loads of different cultures competing against each other and not integrating. It only works with one culture. But anyway, let me show you examples of why multiculturalism is failing. And this is when people come over to another country and rather than leave their troubles and their rivalries and their issues back in the home country or in the home area that they come from, they take it with them, which creates issues for everybody else who's living in this country. And there are two examples that happened in the UK, in the north and south last week. In Manchester, there was a scuffle involving certain Ethiopian ethnic groups in Piccadilly Gardens, and in London, Azerbaijani and Armenian community members were fighting each other. So let's start with my local town, Manchester. I didn't know there was an Ethiopian community. I knew there was Ethiopian businesses, but I thought that was more isolated than an actual community until I saw, a couple of weeks ago, protests. In a similar vein to Black Lives Matter, but it wasn't because they were black. They were protesting because they were a certain Ethiopian ethnic group. Now, these Ethiopians were of the Oromo tribe or ethnic group, and these people are mostly Muslim, but there's also a very strong Christian community as well. It's about 45% Christian, 55% Muslim as far as I'm aware. And these people are, I guess you can consider a truly marginalised class within Ethiopian society, and there's been news of human rights violations that have been going on in Ethiopia against the Oromo. Recently, a well-known Oromo singer was killed by the police, and as a result of this, there was unrest in the country, and what happened was 166 people, unfortunately, got killed. You can see it's very similar in a way to the George Floyd protests, but unlike Black Lives Matter, these people actually have a case and actually do have legitimate concerns and grievances with the Ethiopian government. And in fact, there was protests, not as global, but there were protests around the world wherever there are Ethiopian communities. There was one in Canada, and I think there may have been others in Britain as well, and maybe in Europe somewhere, and in other African countries. But as a result of this, there was a protest in Manchester, and they went down Deansgate marching and demanding justice. And to be honest, I feel sympathy for them. Because they have a case. I looked it up, and it's pretty horrible what's going on over there. But unfortunately, this has resulted in other Ethiopian, now I have no idea what other ethnic group or groups these people were, deciding that they're going to be offended by this, and a fight ensued in Piccadilly Gardens. During, I guess, another mini protest outside of Piccadilly Gardens, and the police had to quickly disperse the fight. Why are they fighting in my city? Why are they doing this? Look, I understand that you have family and friends and grievances in that country, but you live in the United Kingdom. That means you abide by our laws. You are totally fine to protest. You can peacefully assemble. That is usually not against the law, though, because of the lockdown and all that. It's made protesting a little bit more trickier to do. Honestly, it seems to be on a whim. But nonetheless, usually you have that right. What you don't have a right to do is to start fighting each other in public places. Because as far as I'm concerned, when all these various ethnic groups from Ethiopia move over to my country, to my city, I expect them to leave their grievances and their problems at the door. It's no different to going to a bar, as they say. If you have troubles, if you're feeling angry, leave it at the door or go away. And then in London, as I said before, there was a fight involving two groups, Armenians and Azerbaijanis. Now what's happening in the Caucasus is that the two countries are having a kind of low-key undeclared war, as far as I'm aware, and they're fighting over a certain small territory. And of course, in Azerbaijan, they're Muslim, and in Armenia, they are Christian, Orthodox, maybe Catholic, I'm not sure. And there's going to be tensions between the two because of that. You only have to remember what happened in 1915 to understand why the Armenians may not be fans of Azerbaijanis. Now, I don't know whether or not it's a fight over territory because of resources, or is it to decide which ethnic group actually owns said land, but regardless, they've been fighting over it to such an extent that in Azerbaijan, I believe, there were protests demanding an end to their own lockdown and a start of a war against Armenia, a proper war. This spilled over into London, and there was a protest. I don't know whose protest it was, but clearly there was a protest and a counter-protest, and the two began to scuffle and fight. I expect better from all these communities, but particularly the Armenians, because as an ethnic group that are Christian, they're very similar in regards to the British because of that tradition. Now, I expect all these ethnic groups to do what I said before, which is to leave their problems at the door, to not fight each other and start ethnic conflict in another country. But in particular, the Armenians really disappoint me, because I always had the impression that these people were quite civilized and quite, modern for a country where they are in the Caucasus, surrounded by Iran and Russia and Turkey and all that. I really admire these people for the stuff they've gone through and for the hardships they've gone through. I'm really disappointed that these individuals have made Armenians look bad, that they're no better than some of the other groups in society, in British society that is, that are causing issues. I understand that tensions and relations are at an all-time low between your two countries, but how many of those people are actually British citizens? I imagine quite a lot of them are. You're not just fighting an Azerbaijani, you're fighting a British person. A fellow Brit is most likely on the other side, and you're fighting them for stuff that shouldn't even be relevant. You guys should be seeing yourselves as British, not Armenian. Now, maybe these are expats. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe all these people are expats. They're not citizens, in which case they should be arrested. I'm sorry, that's just what it should be. And this is why multiculturalism fails. Because when people are not told expressly to integrate and to leave their conflicts with other peoples behind them, this is what happens. Crime increases. Ethnic tensions increase. We get gang warfare. Essentially, it's gang warfare, this. But none of them are, as far as I'm aware, actually criminal groups. They're just random people deciding to take matters into their own hands. This is not good. We can't be having race wars in the streets. We need order. And multiculturalism, unfortunately, does not bring order with it. It brings more chaos. Multi-ethnic societies, as long as it's a monoculture, don't tend to be as violent. They don't tend to be as chaotic. They don't tend to be as uncohesive as countries that are multicultural. And that, my friends, is today's lesson. When you have a country and you want to bring in other peoples from around the world for whatever reason, maybe labour shortages or whatever, you have an open immigration system, make sure that you have a strong integration policy and a culture that is willing to make sure that these people do conform and integrate. Because otherwise, you're just going to end up with people fighting in the streets and resentment will rise and you will have, well, what we currently have now. Have a good day, guys.